The wind had teeth, and it was biting deep into the hide of Eli Boone's oilskin coat. For 2 days it had been his only companion on the ride back from Abilene. A high, lonesome sound that scoured the plains and promised a winter that would be meaner than most. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, bent its head against the assault, each step a hard-won victory against the driving snow. The world had been reduced to a shifting curtain of white, the sky and the land all one angry blur. Eli was used to it. The loneliness, the cold, the feeling of being the only living soul in a God-forsaken landscape. It was the price of his freedom. He'd built his ranch with hands that were more callous than skin, raising it from nothing in a valley the world had forgotten. He'd fought in a war that had carved lines into his face and put a quiet chill in his eyes, a war that had taught him a man was safest when he was alone. The silence of his cabin was a balm, a place where the ghosts of the past whispered but did not shout. He'd sold his cattle for a fair price, enough to see him through the winter with a little left over. The weight of the coins in his saddlebag was a small, hard comfort against the vast emptiness around him. He thought of his hearth, of the stack of wood he'd cut and seasoned, of the simple meal he would cook. Just a few more miles. He urged Gideon on, his voice a low rasp swallowed by the wind. It was a smudge of color against the white that first caught his eye. Something dark, unnatural. A fallen log, perhaps, or a rock the snow hadn't yet buried. But as Gideon drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a heap of wet wool and frozen limbs, face down in a drift by the side of the barely visible track. Eli swung down from the saddle, his rifle in his hand before his feet hit the ground. Caution was a religion in this country, but the figure didn't move. There was no threat here, only desperation. He knelt, turning the body over. It was a woman. Her face was blue with cold, her lips cracked and pale. A dark stain of frozen blood matted her hair on one side, trailing from a nasty gash on her temple. She was breathing, but only just, a shallow, fluttering thing, like a trapped bird's last efforts. He didn't hesitate. There was no town for 30 miles, and no other soul would be fool enough to be out in this storm. Leaving her was the same as killing her. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of bones and wet cloth. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, wrapping his own body around hers to shield her from the wind's worst fury. She didn't stir. Gideon, sensing the urgency, needed no command to push onward, his powerful legs churning through the deepening snow toward the distant promise of shelter. The cabin was a single room, built of logs Eli had felled and stripped himself. It was spare and clean, smelling of pine smoke, leather, and coffee. He laid the woman on his own cot by the hearth, the only real bed in the place. Her clothes were frozen stiff, with movements that were practical and devoid of any indecency. He cut away the sodden dress with his hunting knife and wrapped her in thick wool blankets he'd traded from the Ute years ago. He stoked the fire until it roared, chasing the chill from the room. He melted snow in a kettle and, when it was warm, used a clean rag to gently wash the blood from her face and the wound on her head. It was a deep cut, ugly and swollen, but it had stopped bleeding. He had no doctor's skills, but he knew how to keep a man from dying of exposure and neglect. He cleaned the wound as best he could and pressed a pad of cloth against it. For the rest of the night, he sat in his straight-back chair, watching her. He fed small spoonfuls of warm broth, made from a piece of dried venison, between her lips whenever she seemed to stir. She never opened her eyes. In the flickering firelight, he saw she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25. Her face, even bruised and half-frozen, held a shadow of something fine and strong. But it was a face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have settled into the bones. He wondered what kind of trouble could drive a woman alone into a blizzard. Trouble was like a wolf. It always found you, but you had to be running mighty hard to meet it halfway in a storm like this. He felt a familiar pull of unwelcome responsibility. He had wanted only to be alone, and now the world, in the form of this broken woman, had found its way to his door. She woke near dawn. The storm had not lessened. It howled around the corners of the cabin like a hungry animal. Eli was dozing in his chair when a small sound, a sharp intake of breath, brought him fully awake. Her eyes were open. They were a deep, guarded gray, and they were filled with a terror so profound it made him keep his distance. He rose slowly, keeping his hands in sight. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here. Found you on the trail." She said nothing. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, taking in the rifle leaning against the wall, the sparse furnishings, the sheer size of him standing there. She tried to sit up, but a wave of pain and dizziness sent her falling back against the cot, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Don't try to move," he advised. "You took a hard knock to the head, and you were near frozen solid." He ladled some more broth into a cup. "You need to get your strength back." He approached the cot slowly, as one would a spooked horse. He held out the cup. She stared at it, then at him, her jaw tight with suspicion. He saw the refusal in her eyes before she could form the words. He simply set the cup on the small crate beside the cot. "It's there if you want it." He turned away, giving her space, and went about his morning chores, checking on Gideon in the lean-to, bringing in more firewood, making coffee. He didn't press her for a name or a story. He knew that sometimes. Silence was the only shield a person had left. He'd lived in his own silence for years. He could respect hers. For 2 days, she did not speak a single word. She ate the food he left for her, her movements small and furtive, like a wild creature learning to trust. She watched him constantly, her gray eyes following him as he moved about the cabin, mending a harness or sharpening his axe. He felt her gaze like a physical weight, a silent question he had no answer for. He offered her his cot and took to sleeping on a bedroll by the fire, a gesture she acknowledged with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Eli was outside, clearing a path to the woodpile, when he heard the cabin door creak open. He turned. She was standing there, wrapped in one of his blankets, her face pale, but her eyes clearer than he'd seen them. "My name is Clara," she said. Her voice was thin and raspy, as if it hadn't been used in a long while. He stopped his work, leaning the shovel against the wall. "Eli Boone," he replied simply. She looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape, a world wiped clean and new. "I was running," she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "From the town, from Harmony Creek." Eli knew the town, a small, pious settlement about a day's ride south. He waited. "My husband, he's dead," she continued, her voice trembling. "His name was Silas. He was not a gentle man." The understatement hung in the cold air, heavier than any curse. He had a temper, especially when he drank. The last time, he came at me with a branding iron, hot from the fire. I picked up a cast-iron skillet. I just wanted him to stop. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists. "I hit him. He fell. He hit his head on the stone hearth." She looked up at Eli, her eyes pleading for something, understanding, maybe, or perhaps just for him not to cast judgment. "They said I killed him. His family, the preacher, they all knew how he was, but they looked the other way. It's easier to blame the wife. They called me a sinner, a murderess. I heard the sheriff was coming for me, so I ran." The wound on her head was from her fall, when her exhausted horse had stumbled in the dark, throwing her into the frozen earth. Eli listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He'd seen the kind of casual cruelty men were capable of, both in war and in peace. He'd seen how townsfolk could turn on one of their own, their righteousness a cloak for their fear and hypocrisy. He didn't doubt her story for a second. "They'll come looking," he said, not as a threat, but as a fact. "I know," she whispered, her shoulders slumping. "I have nowhere to go." He looked at her standing there, a woman with nothing left but the clothes on her back and a story that could get her hanged. He looked at his small cabin, his solitary life. He had built it to keep the world out, but the world had come anyway. Turning her out now would be a death sentence, one way or another. "The snow is deep," he said finally. "No one's traveling for a while. You can stay here, for now." He gestured to the small lean-to where he kept his livestock. "You can help with the animals, earn your keep. There's another cot folded in the corner." A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was the first sign of weakness he had seen in her, and it was more powerful than any plea. "Thank you," she breathed. The words were small, but they filled the space between them. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine. The snow stayed thick on the ground, isolating them completely. Clara, it turned out, had a gentle way with the animals. She spoke to the milk cow and the chickens in a low, soothing voice, her hands sure and steady. Her strength returned slowly, the haunted look in her eyes receding just a little each day. They began to speak more, though their conversations were often punctuated by long, comfortable silences. They never spoke of her husband or the town she had fled. Instead, they talked of practical things, the way a horse favored a certain hoof, the coming signs of a thaw. They talked of grief in the abstract, of the silence that follows a great loss. Eli found himself speaking of the war, not of the battles, but of the quiet moments between them, the shared understanding of men who had seen too much. In Clara, he found a listener who understood what it meant to survive something that should have destroyed you. A fragile trust began to grow between them, as tentative and delicate as the first green shoots of spring under the snow. One afternoon, about a week after Clara's arrival, a new sound broke the stillness. It was a cry, thin and desperate, carried on the wind. Eli grabbed his rifle and went to the door. Clara close behind him. Far down the track, a figure was stumbling through the snow. Another traveler. It was a dangerous time to be on the road. As the figure drew closer, they saw it was another woman, younger than Clara, her clothes hopelessly inadequate for the weather. She was wearing what looked like the tattered remains of a white dress, a wedding dress, now torn and stained with mud, its lace hem dragging in the snow. She was shivering violently, her face a mask of misery and fear. She collapsed on their doorstep, sobbing. Eli and Clara carried her inside and laid her by the fire. She was soaked through and trembling, not from cold alone, but from shock. After a long drink of hot coffee, her story came tumbling out between chattering teeth. Her name was June. She was from back east, an orphan who had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. She'd spent her last dollar on the train ticket and the dress, pinning all her hopes on a man she'd never met, a Mr. Abernathy from a mining town 2 days' ride away. She had arrived that morning, only to discover that her intended groom had not been entirely truthful. He wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for his fourth wife. 3 others, June whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. He had 3 other wives living in that shack with him. He said it was his right, that the Lord had blessed him with a full house. He looked at me like I was a horse he'd just bought at auction. The man had been rough, his eyes greedy. When he'd grabbed her arm, something inside her had snapped. She had hit him with a water pitcher and run. She had just kept running, with no idea where she was going, only knowing she had to get away. Eli listened, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He had no time for men who hid their cruelty behind a Bible. He looked around his small cabin. It was already crowded with one unexpected guest. His supplies were meant for 1 man through a long winter. 2 was a strain. 3 was a danger. Every bite of food they ate was one less for the months ahead. His practical, solitary nature screamed at him to send her on her way as soon as the path was clear. But he looked at her, at the tear-streaked face and the ruined wedding dress. And he couldn't do it. He saw the same desperation he had seen in Clara. He was a hard man, but he was not a cruel one. "You can stay," he said, the words costing him more than he would admit, "until you can figure out what to do next." At first, Clara's reaction to June's arrival was cold. Eli saw it in the stiff set of her shoulders, the way she avoided looking at the younger woman. He understood it. Clara had just begun to carve out a small space of safety for herself in his cabin. And now, here was an intruder, another mouth to feed, another claim on the limited resources of his goodwill. She saw not a fellow survivor, but a rival. But that evening, as June wept quietly by the fire, her thin shoulders shaking, Clara watched her. She saw the tattered dress, the symbol of a hope so brutally shattered. She saw the raw terror of a girl utterly alone in the world, sold and betrayed. Clara looked at June's despair and saw the reflection of her own. The world was a hard place for a woman alone. It broke you or it tried to own you. Slowly, Clara rose and went to the chest at the foot of Eli's cot. She pulled out a thick wool shawl and walked over to June. She didn't say a word. She just gently draped the shawl over the girl's shivering shoulders. June looked up, her eyes full of surprise and gratitude. In that small, silent gesture, a bond was formed. It was a bond of shared misfortune, an unspoken understanding of the unfairness of their fates. And so the three of them settled into a new and awkward rhythm. Life in the small cabin was a dance of close quarters and careful movements. Eli took the floor, leaving the two cots for the women. Their days were filled with the simple, hard work of survival. Eli hunted and chopped wood. Clara tended the animals and cooked their meager meals. June, eager to prove her worth, learned to mend their clothes, her stitches small and neat. They were three strangers, thrown together by a storm, each carrying the weight of a past they could not speak of. Their evenings were the longest part of the day. They would sit by the fire, the silence of the vast, snowbound wilderness pressing in on them. Eli would carve small figures from scraps of wood. Clara would knit. June would simply watch the flames, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. They were a strange, broken little family, sharing the same small circle of light against a great and unforgiving darkness. Their long silences filled with everything they were too afraid to say. The world outside the cabin shrank, buried under successive waves of snow. The drifts climbed the walls, muffling the sound of the wind, sealing the three of them into a pocket of quiet existence. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun they rarely saw. The cold was a constant presence, a fourth resident in the small room, and their lives became a ritual of stoking the fire, of huddling close to its warmth, of surviving. In that enforced stillness, something began to shift. The spaces between them, once filled with the awkwardness of strangers, began to fill with a different kind of silence. It was an intimacy born of shared tasks and unspoken understanding. It lived in the simple moments. June, her own fine hair often a mess, would sit behind Clara in the evenings and carefully brush the tangles from Clara's thick, dark hair. Clara, who had flinched from human touch for so long, found herself slowly, cautiously, leaning into the gentle tug of the brush, her shoulders relaxing fraction by fraction with each stroke. It was a wordless conversation, an act of tending that asked for nothing in return. Eli would sit on the other side of the hearth, a block of pine in one hand and his knife in the other, the blade moving with a slow, hypnotic grace. He was carving animals, his calloused thumbs smoothing the rough wood into life. One evening, he placed a small, intricately detailed horse on the crate beside Clara's cot. Its head was high, its legs poised for flight, a creature of strength and spirit. A few nights later, he set a carving of a soaring bird next to June's belonging in. It was a silent acknowledgement of them both, a message conveyed in a language he was more comfortable with than words. They were seen. They were here. The close quarters and the endless quiet began to peel back the layers they had all worn as armor. One night, as a stew of salted pork and beans bubbled over the fire, Clara began to speak. She spoke of her marriage, not in a rush of anger as she had on that first morning, but with a flat, weary emptiness that was far more chilling. "He never used his fists on my face," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "He was careful about that. He said a man's wife was a reflection on him, and he wouldn't be reflected by bruises everyone could see." She paused, her hands tightening in her lap. The cruelty was a quieter thing. It was in the way he would stand too close, his shadow covering me, the way he would tell me my thoughts were foolish, my feelings were sinful. He made me believe the smallness I felt was my own fault, a failing in my own soul. Eli stopped his carving, the knife still in his hand. He didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. He just listened, his attention absolute. He had seen men like Silas in the army, officers who broke their soldiers not with beatings, but with a slow, grinding erosion of their spirit. He recognized the pattern of the poison. "It changes you," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "To live with that kind of fear, you start to see it in every man's eyes, a look that's held a second too long, a hand that might raise itself. You forget what it feels like to stand in a room and not be afraid." When she was finished, the silence returned. But it was different. It was weighted with her truth. Eli simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect. "A man who has to prove his strength to a woman," he said, his voice a low rumble, "has no real strength at all." In his simple words, there was no pity, only validation. He did not judge her for staying, or for fighting back, or for running. He simply accepted her story as her own. A few nights later, it was June's turn. She looked at the small wooden bird Eli had carved for her, turning it over and over in her hands. "I don't think love is real," she said abruptly, the words sharp in the quiet room. "I think it's just a story people tell themselves so they don't feel so alone." Clara looked up from her mending. "My PA?" June continued, her voice hard. "He sold me into service when I was 12 for the price of a lame mule. The family I worked for, the mister was always patting my arm, telling me what a good, pretty girl I was. His wife just looked at me with cold, dead eyes. She knew. She didn't care. She scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. And then Mr. Abernathy, with his Bible verses and his 3 wives. He talked about love, about taking me into his family. All he wanted was another pair of hands for the chores and another body for his bed." She finally looked at Eli, her gaze challenging. "I've never known a man to be kind without wanting something. Kindness is just a currency, a way to buy what you're after." Eli met her gaze, his own eyes steady. "Maybe you've just known the wrong men," he said quietly. It wasn't an argument, just a statement of possibility. A door left slightly ajar in the locked room of her certainty. The conversation laid bare the wounds they all carried. Clara's fear of touch, June's disbelief in tenderness, Eli's own deep-seated solitude. They were 3 people shipwrecked on the same small island, each with a different reason to fear the sea, and yet, beneath the fear, other currents were stirring. One evening, the air in the cabin grew thick and stifling. Eli took a bucket and went outside to the hand pump to wash. The moon was high and cold, casting the snow-covered landscape in shades of silver and blue. Through the cabin's single window, Clara watched him. He stripped off his shirt, his back to her. The moonlight etched the powerful lines of his shoulders and the clear, sharp ridges of his spine. She could see the faint, silvery tracks of old scars, a map of the violence he had survived. He worked the pump handle, and the icy water splashed over his head and chest. Steam rose from his skin in the frigid air. He moved with an unself-conscious grace, a raw and simple vitality that seemed to belong to the mountains and the winter itself. Clara felt a knot tighten deep in her belly. It was a feeling so foreign, so long buried. She almost didn't recognize it. It was desire, pure and sharp, but it was tangled with a thick, choking vine of guilt. She was a widow. Her husband was barely cold in the ground, a husband she despised, but a husband nonetheless. To feel this for another man felt like a betrayal, not of Silas, but of the grieving, broken woman she was supposed to be. She was torn between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. A voice beside her made her jump. "We're not nuns. Clara!" It was June. Standing so close, Clara hadn't heard her approach. Her voice was low and blunt, holding no judgment, only a plain statement of fact. She had seen where Clara was looking. She had seen the look on her face. Clara's face flushed with heat. She turned away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered, the denial weak and unconvincing. "I think you do," June said softly. "He's a good man. It's all right to see that." June's simple acceptance, her lack of condemnation, was somehow more undoing than an accusation would have been. The carefully constructed walls around Clara's heart crumbled. The tension of the past weeks, the unspoken fears and longings, all came rushing to the surface. "It's not all right," Clara choked out, the words raw with pain. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if to hold her splintering emotions together. "You don't understand. After years of being treated like property, of having to endure a man's touch when it was the last thing on earth you wanted, the thought of it—" She trailed off, a sob catching in her throat. "It makes my skin crawl. I'm so afraid of ever feeling a man's hand on me again." Eli must have heard their raised voices. He came back inside, pulling his shirt on, his hair dripping with melted snow. He looked from Clara's distraught face to June's watchful one, his expression calm and questioning. "Clara," he said gently, "what is it?" June answered for her. "She's afraid of you," she said, her usual bluntness softened by something akin to sympathy. "Of men." The confession hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Clara couldn't bring herself to look at him, staring instead at her own trembling hands. She expected him to recoil, to be offended, or worse, to offer her pity. Instead, Eli moved to the fire and stood with his back to them, giving her space. "I fought in the war," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I saw things that make you forget how to sleep at night, for a long time after. I couldn't stand to be in a crowd, the noise, the people pressing in. I felt like I was suffocating. A man's wounds aren't always where you can see them." He turned to face her then, and his eyes were full of a deep, quiet understanding. There was no pity in them, only a shared knowledge of what it meant to be haunted. "You have nothing to fear from me, Clara," he said, and the words were a solemn vow. "I would never ask for anything you weren't willing to give. I would never take what wasn't offered freely. You're safe here, both of you." His promise settled over the room, a balm on a raw wound. It eased the immediate tension, but the undercurrents remained, stronger and more turbulent than before. The truth of their feelings, Clara's fear and desire, June's cynical longing, Eli's lonely integrity, was now out in the open, a living thing in the small cabin. Later that night, the fragile peace was broken. Clara was lying on her cot, feigning sleep, her mind a whirlwind. She heard the soft creak of the cabin door opening and closing, peeking through her lashes. She saw that June was gone. A moment later, she saw Eli rise from his bedroll and follow her out into the cold, moonlit night. Clara's heart seized with a feeling she couldn't name. She rose and crept to the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. She saw them standing near the woodpile, two dark silhouettes against the glittering snow. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the tension in their stances. Then, in a movement that was both hesitant and desperate, June reached up, pulled Eli's head down, and kissed him. It wasn't a soft or tender kiss. It was hungry, searching, the kiss of someone starving for a connection, for a sign that they mattered. It was a plea and a demand all at once. Clara watched as Eli remained still for a moment before gently, but firmly, taking June's arms and pulling away. He said something to her. His head bowed. June stood frozen for a long moment, then turned and fled back into the cabin, her face hidden in her hands, brushing past Clara without seeing her. Eli remained outside for a long time, staring out at the dark, silent mountains. Clara stood by the window, her own heart aching. She had expected to feel a hot surge of anger, of jealousy. She was prepared for the sting of betrayal, but what she felt was something else entirely, something that surprised and confused her. It was a deep, hollow longing. Watching June's desperate act, she hadn't seen a rival. She had seen a reflection of the crushing loneliness in her own soul. She had seen another woman reaching for the very thing she herself both craved and feared, the warmth of another human being. A moment of feeling wanted, a brief respite from the cold. When Eli finally came back inside, the air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer still. It was charged, thick with unspoken words, with thwarted desires and complicated sorrows. He went to his bedroll. June was a silent, trembling lump under her blankets, and Clara lay on her cot, wide awake. They were all pretending to be unaffected, pretending that nothing had happened. But the loneliness that had once been a shared, quiet companion had now become a suffocating presence, isolating each of them in their own private darkness, a silence more profound and more painful than any they had known before. The thaw, when it came, was not a gentle affair. It arrived with a groan, the sound of a world waking from a long and troubled sleep. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a relentless rhythm counting out the slow passage of time. The snow, which had been their white-walled prison, began to recede, revealing a landscape of sodden brown earth and the first defiant hints of green. With the melting snow came the world, and the world brought its judgment. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a man on a tired-looking mule. He was a traveling pastor, a man named Josiah Miller, whose face was as gaunt and unforgiving as the lands he crossed. He saw the smoke from Eli's chimney and took it as an invitation, a light in the wilderness for a weary soldier of the Lord. He accepted their hospitality, ate their food, and warmed himself by their fire. All the while, his pale, assessing eyes moved from Eli to Clara, and from Clara to June. He saw one man and two women, unmarried and living under a single roof, and his mind, trained to see sin in every shadow, saw not a sanctuary but a den of impropriety. Before he left, he took Eli aside. "The Lord's path is a narrow one. Mr. Boone," he said, his voice low and laced with a chilling certainty. "You are harboring two women of questionable repute, the widow from Harmony Creek, whose husband met a violent end at her own hand, and this other, a runaway of some sort. To live with them in this fashion is to invite scandal, not just upon yourself, but upon this entire valley. It is an arrangement that invites damnation." Eli's face remained a mask of stone. "They were in trouble. I gave them shelter. Charity is a virtue," the pastor conceded, pulling on his thin gloves. "But it must not become a cloak for sin. You are a man alone. It is not right. You must send them away, for the good of their souls, and for your own." He mounted his mule and, without a backward glance, continued on his righteous journey, leaving the poison of his words to seep into the air behind him. The pastor was a sower of seeds, and he planted them in fertile ground. A week later, when Eli rode into the small settlement of Prairie Dog Creek for supplies, he felt the change immediately. Men who had once greeted him with a nod now looked away, their faces closed. Women gathered in tight knots outside the mercantile, their conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. The pastor's warning had become the town's gossip. He learned the shape of the stories from the way people looked at Clara and June when they accompanied him the following week. In the town's eyes, Clara was no longer a desperate woman who had defended herself. She was the widow witch, a black-hearted temptress who had murdered her husband and now lived in sin with her rescuer. June, the terrified mail-order bride, was transformed into a conniving thief, a runaway who had stolen herself from a good, God-fearing man to become a homewrecker's accomplice. And Eli, the solitary, respected rancher, was now Eli the fool, a man so starved for female company he had lost all sense and decency. The ugliness came to a head on a Saturday afternoon. They were loading sacks of flour into the wagon when a group of freighters, reeking of cheap whiskey, swaggered out of the saloon. One of them, a big, red-faced man named Jed, caught sight of Clara. He smirked, showing a row of broken, tobacco-stained teeth. "Well now," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "If it ain't Boone's little whore. Heard you killed your last man with a skillet. You planning on cooking for this one till he's dead, too?" Eli went still. The world seemed to narrow to the space between him and the jeering man. He had weathered insults his whole life, had borne the weight of loneliness and the ghosts of war in silence. But this was different. This was a violation, a defilement of the quiet peace he had found, an attack on a woman who had already endured more than her share of cruelty. Before Clara could even flinch, Eli moved. He crossed the distance in 2 long strides, and his fist, hard as a pine knot, connected with Jed's jaw with a sickening crack. The big man staggered backward, surprise and pain warring on his face, before collapsing in a heap in the dusty street. Silence fell. The other freighters stared, their drunken bravado evaporating. Eli stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his hands clenched. He had not struck another man in anger since the war, and the feeling was like a jolt of lightning, terrifying and cleansing all at once. A hand fell on his shoulder. It was the sheriff, a weary, graying man named Brody. "That's enough, Eli," he said, his voice tired. He didn't look at the man on the ground. He looked at Eli. "Come with me." In the dusty quiet of the sheriff's office, Brody poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He pushed one toward Eli. "Jed's a loudmouth and a fool," he said, sinking into his chair with a sigh. "He had it coming. We both know that. But that's not the problem." He took a long drink. "The problem, Eli, is that folks are talking. The pastor was through here last month, filling everyone's heads with fire and brimstone. People are scared. They see you up there with those 2 women, and they don't see charity. They see a challenge to the way things are done." He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his gaze direct and stripped of any pretense. "I don't much care what a man does on his own land, but the law does. 1 wife is a marriage. Eli, 2 is a felony. They call it bigamy. In this territory, a man can hang for it, and they'll call those women your accomplices. This ain't about what's right or wrong in the eyes of God. This is about what's legal in the eyes of a judge. You keep on like this, and you're going to bring a whole world of trouble down on all 3 of you." The ride back to the cabin was a silent one. The sheriff's words lay between them, heavy and cold as iron. That night, by the fire, the sanctuary of their home felt like a trap. The outside world had breached their walls, and it would not be ignored. "He's right," Eli said, breaking the silence. "This can't go on." He looked at Clara, then at June. Their faces were pale in the firelight, their eyes wide with a familiar fear. "I see one way out of this," he said, the words coming slow and deliberate. "A way to make it right in the eyes of the law, to give one of you a name, a protection." He took a deep breath. "I'll marry one of you, whichever one wants it. We'll tell the town the other is just a hired hand, staying on till spring. It'll quiet the talk. It'll keep you safe." He made the offer as he would offer a shield in a battle. It was practical. It was honorable. and it was born of a profound sense of duty. But he did not understand the landscape of the hearts he was trying to protect. Clara was the first to speak. She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "No, Eli," she said softly. "Thank you, but no." She looked at him, and her gray eyes were clear and resolute. "I spent 6 years being a man's property. I ran from a town that wanted to own my crime, to own my shame. I will not trade one cage for another, no matter how kindly it's offered. You don't owe me salvation. I have to find my own." Then June spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "I came out here because I was promised a home, a life. What I found was a man who wanted to buy me like a broodmare." She looked down at her hands, then back up at Eli, her gaze fierce. "I appreciate what you're offering, more than you know, but I won't be a solution to a problem. I won't be taken out of pity. If I ever marry a man, it will be because he wants me, not because he feels sorry for me. I want love, Eli, not pity." Their refusals, so gentle and yet so absolute, left a void in the room. Eli's simple, masculine solution had been swept aside, revealing the far more complex truth of their situation. They were not seeking a legal arrangement. They were seeking something far more elusive. The tension in the cabin grew thick and heavy in the days that followed. The unspoken desires, the fears, the longings, all churned beneath the surface of their quiet daily routines. One night, the fragile dam holding it all back finally broke. They had finished their supper. June was asleep on her cot, or pretending to be, her breathing deep and even. Eli was staring into the fire, his face a mask of troubled thoughts. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a confusing mix of gratitude, fear, and a warmth that was spreading through her veins like a slow tide. His offer of marriage, though she had refused it, had been an act of profound kindness. He had been willing to bind himself to her, to protect her. She rose from her chair and went to him. He looked up as she approached. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The words were all tangled up inside her. Instead, she knelt in front of him, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, hesitant and gentle. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude. A kiss that asked for comfort, a kiss that asked for warmth against the terrible coldness of the world. He was still for a moment, surprised, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close. His response was as gentle as her advance. What happened next was not a surrender, but a discovery. He led her to his bedroll, and they made love with a slowness that bordered on reverence. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of her own body. Every touch was a question, not a demand. Every movement was a shared breath, not an act of possession. It was quiet and filled with a trembling, fragile emotion that brought tears to her eyes. In the arms of this quiet, lonely man, she felt something she had long ago believed was lost to her forever. She felt safe, from her cot in the shadows. June watched. Through the sliver of her barely open eyelids, she saw it all. She saw the gentleness, the tenderness. She saw the way Eli held Clara afterward, his hand stroking her hair as she fell asleep, and she did not feel the sting of jealousy she had expected. Instead, a single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her temple. She was witnessing a kindness she had only ever dreamed of, a safety she had believed to be a myth, and the sight of it, the reality of it, broke her heart with a longing so vast and so deep it was a physical pain. The next day, June was a ghost. She moved through her chores in silence, her eyes averted, her face pale and drawn. She avoided both Eli and Clara, creating a chasm of silence that was more painful than any argument. That afternoon, Clara found her in the lean-to, brushing Gideon with short, jerky strokes. "June," Clara said softly. June kept brushing, her back to Clara. "Leave me be." "I can't," Clara said, her voice gentle. "Talk to me, please." June finally stopped. She turned around, and her face was a mess of unshed tears and raw anguish. "What is there to talk about?" she burst out, her voice cracking. "I saw you last night. I saw you both." "I know," Clara whispered. "Don't you understand?" June cried, the brush falling from her hand. "It's not that I'm angry at you. I'm not. It's—" Her voice broke, and she finally let the sobs come. Great, wrenching sounds from the depths of her soul. Clara moved forward and wrapped her arms around the younger woman, holding her as she shook. "I want what you had." June wept into Clara's shoulder. "I want to feel safe like that, just once. I want someone to hold me like I matter, not like they own me. I want to feel what you felt." That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted again. After Clara had fallen asleep, a quiet exhaustion finally claiming her, June rose from her cot. She went to Eli, who was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his watch not yet over. He looked up as she knelt before him, her eyes shining with tears in the dim light. She didn't kiss him this time. She simply took his hand and held it to her cheek. "Please," she whispered, the single word, a universe of need. "Don't let me be alone tonight." What passed between them was not the gentle healing that had happened with Clara. It was something fiercer, more desperate. It was an answer to a lifetime of coldness. It was a fierce, emotional collision of two lonely souls, a desperate clinging in the dark. It was a release of all June's pent-up pain and longing. And Eli met her, not with pity, but with a powerful, grounding strength, holding her as if he could absorb her sorrow into himself. On her cot, Clara lay awake. She heard the soft whispers. She heard the rustle of blankets. She heard the sharp, indrawn breath that was not of pain, but of release. And she did not move. She did not stop it. She lay there in the darkness and listened. And she understood. She understood June's desperate need for warmth, for affirmation, was no different from her own. The world had broken them in different ways, but their wounds all ached with the same loneliness. For the first time, in the quiet aftermath, the three of them spoke. The darkness gave them courage, their voices soft, disembodied things in the silent cabin. "I heard you," Clara said into the blackness, her voice clear and without judgment. There was a long pause. Then Eli's voice, low and rough with emotion. "I know." Then June's, small and trembling. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Clara said, and the truth of the words surprised even herself. "I'm not." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a new, terrifying, and yet liberating possibility. They had crossed a boundary and found themselves in an unknown land with no maps to guide them. They were three broken people, bound together by circumstance, by danger, and now by a love so complicated it had no name. It was Clara who finally gave voice to the thought that hovered in the darkness, a whisper that would change everything. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other." Clara's whispered words hung in the darkness of the cabin, not as a question, but as a revelation. Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other. It was a seed planted in the dead of winter, and with the coming of spring, it began to grow. The world outside their small valley was reborn. And so, it seemed, were they? The oppressive weight of the snow gave way to the smell of wet earth and pine. The silence of the drifts was replaced by the chatter of returning birds and the rush of the creek, now swollen with meltwater. The ranch, which had been a stark collection of buildings against a white canvas, became alive with purpose. The change within the cabin was just as profound. The brittle tension that had followed their nights of confession and connection slowly dissolved, replaced by a new, unspoken language. They were no longer three separate individuals clinging to the same piece of driftwood. They had become a single, functioning unit, a complex and interwoven organism learning to move with a shared rhythm. They worked in tandem, their movements flowing around each other with an economy of motion that came from deep familiarity. Eli would be splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat for their days. And June would appear with a tin cup of water, her presence a quiet offering. Clara, who had a knowledge of plants from her childhood, would take Eli into the newly green hills to show him which roots were good for soup and which leaves could be dried for tea. When the time came to brand the new calves Eli had acquired, they worked as a team. He handled the hot iron with a steady hand. Clara soothed the frightened animals with her low, calm voice, and June, who had conquered her initial fear of the large beasts, kept the tally with a piece of charcoal on a smooth plank of wood. In these shared labors, they began to heal. The haunted look in Clara's eyes was replaced by a quiet serenity. In the mornings, when the sun first streamed through the window, Eli would often find her smiling to herself, a small, secret smile of contentment. It was the unclenching of a fist she hadn't known she was making for years. June, who had once declared love a myth, began to discover it in small, unexpected moments. It was in the way Eli showed her how to properly hold a hammer to mend a fence, his large hand gently guiding hers, his voice patient and low. It was in the way Clara would save her the last piece of cornbread, knowing it was her favorite. And one afternoon, while watching a clumsy foal try to stand on its wobbly legs, June laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, a sound they thought had been permanently stolen from her. The sound startled them all, and then Eli found himself smiling, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes, and the three of them stood there in the spring sunshine, sharing a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Eli felt a sense of peace he had not known since before the war. The ghosts that walked with him had grown quiet, soothed by the gentle hum of this new life. He was no longer just a solitary man enduring his existence. He was part of something. He loved them, he realized, with a fierce and protective clarity. He loved Clara for her resilience, for the quiet strength that was like the deep, unshakable roots of an old oak. He loved June for her spirit, for the defiant spark that had refused to be extinguished by the world's cruelty. It was a love that was not possessive or demanding. It was a love that simply was, a braid of different threads, respect, tenderness, desire, woven together into something strong and new. They had, against all odds, built a fragile paradise in their forgotten valley. But the world outside their valley had a long memory and a harsh sense of order. The serpent arrived, not in their garden, but in the dusty main street of Prairie Dog Creek, June's former betrothed. The pious Mr. Abernathy rode into town on a horse that was too fine for a man of his supposed humility. He had spent the last month tracking his stolen property, his fury fueled by righteousness and wounded pride. He learned soon enough of the woman who had sought shelter with the reclusive rancher, Eli Boone. He did not ride out to the ranch. His methods were more insidious. He went to the sheriff and then to the pastor, his voice ringing with indignation. He spoke of a contract broken, of a flighty, sinful girl who had run from her sacred obligations. He painted Eli as a villain, a man who harbored fugitives and preyed on the weak. His final, chilling threat was whispered into the right ears. "If that girl is not returned to me, I will report Mr. Boone to the territorial marshal. Harboring a runaway is a serious offense, especially when the girl is promised in matrimony." The threat of the law, of federal power, was a far more dangerous weapon than a gun. The town, already primed by Pastor Miller's gossip, readily absorbed Abernathy's poison. The whispers grew louder, bolder. The delicate peace of the ranch was about to be shattered. The first stone was cast at Clara. She had ridden to the general store alone to trade eggs for thread and salt. As she stood at the counter, the storekeeper's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, looked past her as if she were made of glass. A few other women in the store gathered their skirts and moved away, their whispers loud enough to be heard. "The widow witch," one of them hissed. The name, ugly and sharp, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her hands trembled, and she dropped her basket, the eggs smashing on the rough floorboards. She fled the store, the sound of muffled, mocking laughter following her out into the street. She rode home with her face burning and her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The final blow came that Sunday, from the pulpit of the town's small, clapboard church. Pastor Miller delivered a sermon on the festering sickness of sin. He spoke of impurity and licentiousness, of households built on a foundation of shame. He did not name Eli Boone, but every soul in that church knew who he was talking about. After the service, a special meeting of the congregation was held. It was brief and decisive. They voted by a show of hands to excommunicate Eli Boone from their community of faith. He was to be cast out, his soul declared forfeit, unless and until he cleansed his house and sent the two fallen women away. He was officially an outcast. The news reached them via a young boy who worked for the livery, a boy Eli had once helped set a splint on a broken arm. He delivered the message with downcast eyes, mumbled his piece, and fled as if the ground around the cabin were cursed. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in on them. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. The world had declared war on their small life. They were surrounded, with no allies and nowhere to run. Despair was a palpable thing in the room, thick as smoke. "It's over," June whispered, her voice hollow. "Abernathy will send the marshal. They'll drag me back there. And they'll come for me," Clara added, her voice flat with defeat. "For Silas. They'll say I ran because I was guilty. They'll hang me." Eli looked at their faces, at the terror and resignation etched there, and something inside him, something hard and unyielding that had been forged in the crucible of war, refused to break. He had lost everything once before. He would not lose this, not them. He rose from his chair and stood before the hearth, his back to the fire, his shadow long and dark on the floor. "The town has made its decision," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through their fear. "The church has made its judgment. The law has its rules." He looked from Clara's face to June's, his gaze holding them, anchoring them. "They've told us we can't live as we are. They've given us their answer. So now, we give them ours." He took a deep breath. "I offered before to marry one of you, to give you the protection of my name. You were right to refuse. It was a half measure, a lie. I will not live a lie." He paused, and the words he spoke next fell into the charged silence with shocking weight. "I am not choosing. I will not choose. A man's heart is not a piece of land to be divided up and parceled out. It is a house, and my house has room enough for you both." Clara and June stared at him, their eyes wide, barely daring to breathe. "The world outside has its laws, written in books and spoken by judges," Eli continued, his voice resonating with a strange, fierce passion. "They mean nothing here. In this cabin, we have our own laws. The law of survival, the law of kindness, the law of this, whatever this is." He gestured to the three of them, to the small circle of warmth and light they had created. "So I'm asking, not for the world, not for the town or the church, for us. I want to marry you both. Not in a church, not with a preacher. Right here, by our fire, our own ceremony." It was a shocking proposal, a defiant cry against the entire world. It was madness. It was dangerous. And in that moment, to the two women who had been given nothing but shame and condemnation, it was the most beautiful, hopeful thing they had ever heard. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow. June looked at Eli, and in her eyes, he saw not the cynical girl who believed love was a transaction, but a woman who was finally willing to believe it could be a miracle. There were no white dresses, no flowers, no witnesses save the silent, watching stars through the window. Their ceremony was an act of quiet, desperate truth. Eli took a single branch of seasoned maple he had been saving, and with his sharpest knife, He carefully carved 3 simple rings. They were not perfect circles, but they were cut from the same wood, forever linked. They stood before the hearth, the firelight dancing on their faces, and they spoke their vows. They were not words from a book. They were pieces of their souls, offered up as pledges. Clara went first, her voice thick with emotion as she slipped a ring onto Eli's finger. "I was lost," she whispered. "You gave me a safe harbor. I vow to always be a place of peace and strength for this family." She then turned to June, her hands trembling as she slid a ring onto her finger. "You showed me that my wounds did not have to be the end of my story. I vow to be your sister, in all things." June followed, her tears flowing freely. She placed a ring on Eli's finger. "I did not believe in kindness," she said, her voice shaking. "You taught me what it was. I vow to bring laughter and light into this home." She turned to Clara. "You held me when I was broken. I vow to always hold you in my heart." Finally, Eli took the last 2 rings. He looked at Clara. "You have a strength that shames mountains," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. "You taught me that silence does not have to mean loneliness. I vow to be your steady hand." He then turned to June, his eyes full of a deep, protective tenderness. "You have a fire in you that the world tried to put out. You taught me that a man's heart can be bigger than he ever knew. I vow to be your shield." They stood in a circle, their hands joined, the simple wooden rings a testament to their impossible, defiant union. They had been condemned by the world, so they had created their own. They had been cast into the darkness, so they had made their own light. That night, there were no separate cots or bedrolls. They came together in the soft glow of the fire, 3 points of light in an encroaching darkness. It was a night of raw, honest love. There was no shame, no jealousy, no fear. There was only a vast, quiet gratitude that swelled in the small cabin until it filled every corner. The world had told them they were wrong. The world had called them sinners. But as they held each other through the long, peaceful night, they knew, with a certainty that defied all law and logic, that they were finally, truly, home. None of them were alone anymore. For a few precious weeks, the cabin was not a shelter or a prison, but a home. A fragile, impossible happiness took root in the valley. It lived in the quiet rhythm of their mornings, the shared pot of coffee steaming on the hearth, the way their bodies moved around each other in the small space without collision, a dance they had learned by heart. There was an ease between them, a deep and settled comfort that had seemed unattainable just months before. Eli would watch June teach Clara a cat's cradle game with a piece of string, their heads bent close together, and a warmth would spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Clara would see the way Eli's hand rested on June's back in a gesture of simple, protective affection, and she would feel not a sting of jealousy, but a sense of rightness, of completion. Their love was a language they were inventing as they went along, a vocabulary of shared glances, of hands brushing as they passed, of 3 sets of boots lined up by the door. They were a family, bound not by law or blood, but by a shared will to survive and a defiant choice to love in the face of a world that would have condemned them for it. They knew it was a stolen piece, a pocket of warmth in a long and unforgiving winter. But for a short time, they allowed themselves to believe it might just last. The world shattered their peace with the arrival of a rider and a folded piece of paper. The rider was a boy from the next county, paid $1 to deliver the official-looking envelope and ask for no reply. Eli took it, his hand steady, but a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Inside, the letter was from a territorial clerk. It was a formal notice, cold and stark in its legal language. Mr. Silas Abernathy had filed formal charges with the circuit judge. The charges were threefold: harboring a fugitive, referring to June's flight from her contractual obligation, impeding a marital contract, and, most damningly, the charge of bigamy, an accusation based on the sworn testimony of Pastor Josiah Miller, who described the unholy and illicit arrangements he had witnessed. The letter laid out the consequences in black and white. Eli could face imprisonment, a long and brutal sentence in the territorial prison, or worse, depending on the mood of the judge. June could be forcibly returned to Abernathy, legally bound to him as his ward, if not his wife, and Clara, as a material witness to the alleged crimes and a woman of already questionable character, could be held indefinitely. Her own unresolved case in Harmony Creek inevitably brought back to light. The paper was not just a legal notice. It was a death warrant for the life they had built. They stood in the cabin, the letter on the table between them like a coiled snake. The joyous warmth of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by an icy fear. "He will not take me back," June whispered, her face ashen. "I will die first." "They will hang me," Clara said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "This will be all the proof they need." Eli looked at their terrified faces, and a cold, hard fury rose in him. He had built this life with his own 2 hands, had defended it with his fists, had consecrated it with his heart. He would not let it be destroyed by the scribblings of a clerk and the malice of a hypocrite. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They will not. We're leaving." The decision was instant and absolute. There was no other choice. "We'll go west," he said, the plan forming as he spoke. "To Oregon. The territory is vast, the laws are new, and people don't ask as many questions. We can find a new valley. We can start again." Hope, fragile but fierce, flickered back to life. Fleeing was a desperate gamble, but it was better than the slow, certain death of waiting for the law to arrive. They began to prepare at once, a frantic energy seizing them. They worked through the day and into the night, their movements swift and silent. Clara packed what little food they could carry: dried meat, flour, coffee, salt. June gathered their blankets, the spare ammunition for the rifle and Eli's pistol, and the small wooden carvings Eli had made them, wrapping them carefully in a piece of cloth. Eli prepared the horses, choosing their 3 strongest mounts, ensuring their shoes were sound, and filling the saddlebags with tools and supplies. They were stripping their home bare, turning their sanctuary back into a simple shelter they would abandon. With every item packed, a piece of their brief happiness was being dismantled. They planned to leave before dawn, to use the darkness as their shield. They were too late. Just as the moon was rising, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the valley, not one horse, but many. Eli grabbed his rifle and peered out the window. In the pale moonlight, he could see a dozen riders cresting the small hill that led to his cabin. At the front was Sheriff Brody, his badge glinting. But the men behind him were not deputies. They were townsmen, their faces grim and set in the moonlight. It was a posse, a mob, "They're here," Eli said, his voice grim. "Get to the back. Stay away from the door." Clara and June scrambled to the far side of the room, their hearts pounding. Eli stood by the door, rifle in hand, his body a solid, unmoving wall between his family and the men who had come to destroy it. "Eli Boone!" Sheriff Brody's voice rang out in the night. "Come out with your hands empty. I have a warrant for your arrest." "On what charge, Brody?" Eli called back, his voice steady. "On the charge of breaking the laws of God and man," another voice shouted, thick with righteousness. It was Pastor Miller. "On the charge of living in filth and sin." Eli ignored him. "What's the warrant say?" "Sheriff?" "It says bigamy, Eli, and harboring a fugitive. Now come on out. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Eli knew it was hopeless. He was 1 man against 12. A gunfight would be a suicide, and it would get Clara and June killed. He had to protect them. Slowly, he uncocked his rifle and leaned it against the wall. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, his hands raised to his shoulders. "I'm coming out," he said. "There's no need for trouble." But the men behind the sheriff were not interested in peace. They had come for righteous vengeance. As soon as Eli was clear of the doorway, 2 of them rushed him. dragging him off the porch and throwing him to the ground. They tore his hands behind his back and bound them tightly with rope. Jed, the freighter Eli had punched, was among them. His face, still bruised, twisted into a malicious grin. He drove his boot into Eli's ribs, a grunt of satisfaction escaping his lips.
"That's for my jaw, you blaspheming son of a bitch!"
he spat. Eli grunted in pain but did not cry out. Sheriff Brody tried to intervene.
"That's enough! Jed, he's my prisoner!"
But the mob was not listening. They hauled Eli to his feet, and as they dragged him toward a horse, they struck him with their fists and the butts of their rifles. Clara and June screamed, rushing out onto the porch.
"Stop it! Leave him alone!"
Clara cried, her voice raw with terror. June ran toward the sheriff, her hands clasped in a desperate plea.
"Please, Sheriff! He's a good man! He only ever helped us! Please, don't let them do this!"
Sheriff Brody wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked away, his face a mask of weary resignation. "The law's the law, miss. There's nothing I can do." Pastor Miller stepped forward, his face severe in the moonlight. "Your pleas are for the devil, girl. You should be on your knees begging for the salvation of your wicked souls." They were deaf to mercy. The town had passed its judgment. Clara and June could only watch in helpless horror as the men threw Eli, bleeding and bruised, over a saddle and led him away into the night. His ranch, his home, now a crime scene. Eli was thrown into the town's single jail cell, a small, foul-smelling room with a dirt floor and a single barred window. The next morning, Pastor Miller came to visit, his Bible held before him like a shield. He stood outside the bars, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. "I have come to pray for your soul, Mr. Boone," he said, "though I fear it may be a wasted effort. You have turned your back on God, on decency, on the sacred laws of marriage." Eli slowly pushed himself up from the hard cot, his ribs aching with every breath. He looked at the preacher, and his eyes, though swollen, were clear and steady. "Did you ever fight in the war, preacher?" The question took the pastor by surprise. "I did not. I was doing the Lord's work here at home." "I did," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. "I saw men die for a piece of ground they'd never see again. I saw boys cry for their mothers in muddy fields. I lay in the dark for years after. Preacher, feeling nothing at all. I was a dead man walking. I was alone, and the silence was eating me alive." He moved closer to the bars, his gaze intense. "And then I found them, or they found me, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt something other than cold. They were broken, and I was broken, and we fit together. We kept each other alive." He looked the pastor square in the eye, his voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a conviction that was more powerful than any sermon. "You talk about sin. If loving 2 women who needed a safe place to land is a sin, if building a home with them and feeling a piece of my own soul come back to life is a sin, then maybe sin is all that ever kept me alive." The pastor recoiled, sputtering about blasphemy and eternal damnation, but his words had no power. Eli had spoken his truth, and it was a truth the preacher's narrow world could not comprehend. That night, the town of Prairie Dog Creek was quiet. The deputy tasked with watching the jail was a young man who was more interested in a bottle of whiskey than his duties. He sat dozing in the sheriff's office, the door to the cell block unlocked. A floorboard creaked. The deputy's head snapped up. Clara was standing there. In her hands, she held Eli's rifle, and its long, dark barrel was pointed directly at his chest. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold, hard fire the boy had never seen before.
"Where are the keys?"
she asked, her voice low and steady, without a trace of a tremor. The deputy stared, his mouth agape. "Ma'am, I can't."
"I am not asking again,"
Clara said, and she cocked the rifle. The click was the loudest sound in the world. "I have lost everything once before. I have nothing left to lose. You will give me the keys, or I swear on my mother's grave, I will burn this courthouse.
this whole rotten town, to the ground, starting with you."
The boy, shaking, fumbled for the ring of keys on the wall and slid them across the floor. Clara never took her eyes off him. She retrieved the keys, unlocked Eli's cell, and helped him to his feet.
"June has the horses,"
she whispered, handing him his pistol from her belt. "In the alley behind the mercantile. We have to go, now." They moved like ghosts through the sleeping town. June was waiting, as promised, with their 3 best horses, their saddlebags packed and ready. She had gathered every supply she could find, her fear channeled into a sharp, practical efficiency. They mounted up and rode out, not on the main road, but toward the narrow, winding canyons to the south. They rode hard, the clatter of their horses' hooves a desperate drumbeat against the silence of the pre-dawn hours. They had a head start, but not a big one. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon, they heard it, the baying of hounds and the distant shouts of men. A posse was after them. They pushed their horses faster, the animals' sides heaving, their breath pluming in the cold morning air. The canyon walls rose around them, offering cover but also trapping them in the narrow passage. Gunshots echoed, the bullets whining off the rocks around them. They were no longer just fugitives. They were prey. Eli, riding in the rear, returned fire, trying to slow them down, to give Clara and June a chance to get ahead. Another volley of shots rang out from the posse, who were closing the distance. June cried out, a sharp, sudden gasp of pain. She slumped forward in her saddle.
"June!" Clara screamed.
A dark stain was spreading across the shoulder of June's dress. She had been hit. The bullet's impact threw June forward against the pommel of her saddle, a sharp, ragged cry torn from her lips. For a heart-stopping moment, the world seemed to freeze, the pursuing shouts, the echo of the gunshot, the panicked breath of the horses. Then chaos erupted anew. Eli spurred his horse alongside hers, his face a grim mask of fury and fear. He reached across, his arm a band of iron around her waist, holding her steady as her horse stumbled.
"Clara!"
he roared over the din.
"Take the lead horse! Get up into the rocks, now!"
There was no hesitation. Clara, her face white but her hands steady on the reins, grabbed the lead rope of June's horse and urged them forward, away from the open canyon floor and toward the treacherous, rock-strewn slopes that marked the beginning of the high mountains. It was a desperate, suicidal climb, but it was their only chance. The narrow, winding path of the canyon had become a shooting gallery. The mountains were their only sanctuary. Eli fired his pistol back at the posse, the shots aimed not to kill but to slow, to make them wary. The bullets kicked up dust near the hooves of the lead riders, forcing them to pull back for a moment. It was the only opening they needed. Clara, with a strength born of pure terror and love, guided the panicked horses up the steep incline, their iron-shod hooves scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale. Eli brought his own horse alongside June's.
"You have to hold on,"
he gritted out, his eyes scanning her pale, pain-filled face. The stain on her shoulder was spreading, a dark, terrifying flower blooming on the white fabric of her dress. She nodded weakly, her teeth clamped shut against a moan. He knew a wounded rider would slow them down to a fatal pace. There was only one way. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled his horse in tight, leaned over, and lifted her bodily from her saddle and into his own, settling her in front of him. She cried out as the movement jarred her wound, her head slumping against his chest. He wrapped one arm around her, holding her tight against him, and took the reins of her now empty horse.
"Go!"
he yelled to Clara. And together, a small, desperate caravan of 3 people and 3 horses, they scrambled up into the unforgiving wilderness of the high peaks, leaving the posse and the world of men behind. They survived the chase, the posse, unwilling to risk their own necks and horses on the treacherous mountain terrain for a disgraced rancher and 2 women, fired a few more angry, parting shots before finally giving up. their shouts fading into the vast silence of the rocks. But survival was only the beginning of their ordeal. They were now fugitives in a land that offered no mercy. The days that followed were a blur of hardship, a waking nightmare painted in shades of gray rock and biting wind. Eli carried June, who drifted in and out of a feverish consciousness. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of her shoulder, a miracle of luck, but the wound was raw, and the risk of infection was a constant, terrifying shadow. Clara became their guide, her quiet resilience hardening into a core of pure steel. She led the horses, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain, finding paths that seemed impossible, her hands raw and bleeding from the coarse leather of the reins. Their first night was spent huddled in the shallow lee of a rock outcropping that offered little protection from a wind that seemed intent on slicing them to the bone. Clara tore strips from her own petticoat to clean and bandage June's wound with icy water from a mountain stream. Eli, his own body a canvas of bruises and aching ribs from the beating he had taken, stood watch, his rifle across his lap, his ears straining against the silence for any sound of pursuit. They did not light a fire, fearing the smoke would give them away. They ate nothing, their hunger a dull ache compared to the sharp, piercing dread of being caught. Fear was their constant companion. It was in the snap of a twig that could be a tracker, the shadow of a circling hawk that could be a man on a ridge. But they did not break. The hardship, instead of shattering them, forged them together in the fire of shared suffering. Their love, born in the warmth of a cabin, was now being tested in the crucible of a frozen wilderness. And it was proving to be a powerful, unyielding thing. When June shivered uncontrollably with fever, Eli stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around her, sitting with her cradled in his arms all night, sharing his own body heat while Clara huddled against his back, the three of them a small, tight knot of warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. They ate what they could find. Eli, a skilled hunter, managed to trap 2 scrawny rabbits, and they cooked them over a tiny, smokeless fire of dry twigs in a deep crevice, the meat tasting like the most glorious feast they had ever known. They spoke little, saving their energy for the climb. Their communication was in their actions. It was in the way Clara would pass Eli the last piece of cooked rabbit, and he would pass it to June. And June, with her good hand, would break it in 2 and insist Eli eat his share. It was in the way Eli would scan Clara's face for signs of exhaustion, forcing her to rest even when she insisted she could go on. They were no longer just a man and 2 women. They were a single entity, a 3-headed, 6-armed creature, moving with a single purpose: to live. After a week that felt like a lifetime, they finally descended from the highest peaks, leaving the snow line behind them. They stumbled out of the mountains into a green, wooded valley, a place so remote and untouched it felt like the first day of creation. And in that valley, they found what they were looking for: a settlement. It was not a town, but a handful of rough-hewn cabins clustered around a muddy track, a place called Haven's Fork. It was a frontier outpost in the truest sense, a place for people who were running from something: the law, a bad debt, a past they wanted to bury. No one asked them questions. They saw a hard-looking man and 2 weary women, their clothes in tatters, their faces etched with hardship. They saw survivors, and in Haven's Fork, that was the only currency that mattered. Eli traded his spare pistol for a month's lease on an abandoned trapper's cabin on the edge of the settlement and a promise of work helping to clear a new field. Their new home was a hovel compared to the solid, comfortable cabin Eli had built with his own hands. It was a single, small room with a leaking roof and a stone hearth that smoked, but it was theirs. It was a place to stop running. It was a place to begin again. And so they built their new life, piece by piece, out of the wreckage of the old one. The first task was to nurse June back to health. The clean air and the rest worked their magic, and the fever finally broke. Clara made a healing poultice from herbs she found in the woods, and slowly, the wound began to close. Color returned to June's cheeks. and the light returned to her eyes. As June recovered, the three of them worked to make the cabin a home. Eli, using his axe and his wits, felled trees and split logs, patching the roof and building a new, solid door to keep out the night. Clara, with a fierce, domestic energy, scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, chinking the walls with moss and mud to keep out the drafts. June, her arm still in a sling, used her good hand to sand rough-hewn planks of wood until they were smooth. And from them, Eli built them a small, sturdy table. Their life was smaller now, simpler. They had almost nothing, but in that shared poverty, they found a richness they had never known. June, who had once been so cynical, now found joy in the smallest things: the taste of wild berries, the intricate pattern of a spider's web, the warmth of the sun on her face. She began to fill a small, leather-bound journal Eli had traded for, not with accounts or tallies, but with words. She was writing poems, shyly at first, then with a growing confidence, capturing the beauty and the pain of their journey, finding her own voice in the quiet of their new life. Clara, who had always cooked out of necessity, now cooked with laughter. The sound of her humming as she stirred a pot of stew over the fire became the new heartbeat of their home. The fear that had lived in her for so long had finally been banished, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. She planted a small garden behind the cabin, her hands in the rich, dark earth, and as the first green shoots began to poke through, it felt as though she were planting a piece of her own soul, putting down roots in this new, free soil. At night, Eli would sit by the fire, holding them both. He would sit with his back against the wall, Clara curled on one side, June on the other, their heads resting on his shoulders. He would feel the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of their bodies against his, and a profound, bone-deep contentment would settle over him. The ghosts of the war were gone. The loneliness that had been his shadow for a decade had vanished. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a husband. He was a protector. He was home. Months passed. The green of spring deepened into the lush, heavy green of summer. One afternoon, a grizzled prospector, passing through on his way to California, stopped at their cabin to ask for water. He was a talkative man, full of news and gossip from the territories he had crossed. He spoke of a town called Prairie Dog Creek. "Strangest thing," he said, scratching his beard. "The whole town seems to have lost its spirit. The sheriff, old fella named Brody, he just up and quit, said he was too old to be chasing shadows and leading mobs. They say he lost his nerve after a prisoner he had, some rancher, escaped and vanished into the mountains. And the preacher they had, a real fire and brimstone type. He took ill, a wasting sickness. Some say it's a judgment for his pride." The prospector shrugged. "All I know is, no one's talking about that rancher anymore. It's like they all just want to forget it ever happened. No one is chasing them anymore." He drank his water, thanked them, and went on his way, oblivious to the thunderous silence he left behind him. The chase was over. The past was finally, truly, dead. They were free. That evening, the three of them stood outside their cabin, watching the sun set behind the distant, purple mountains. The sky was a riot of orange and pink, a final, glorious blaze of color before the quiet of the night. It was a scene of perfect peace. Clara stood with a basket of vegetables from her garden, her hands stained with the good, clean dirt of her labor. June stood beside her, cradling her journal of poems, her face serene and thoughtful, and Eli stood between them, his arms around them both. In his arms, he held a small child, a baby no more than a year old, wrapped in a soft blanket. They had found him 2 weeks earlier, alone and crying in an abandoned homestead a day's ride away, his parents victims of a fever, a small, orphaned soul in a vast wilderness. They had taken him in without a second thought. He was theirs now, their son, their future. The town of Prairie Dog Creek with its narrow laws and its even narrower hearts, had once said that a man could not have two brides. They had called it a sin, an abomination, an impossibility. But here, in this quiet mountain cabin, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, the proof of their lie was in every quiet morning, in every shared smile. It was in the feel of a sleeping child's breath, and in every whispered "I love you" that was meant not for one, but for three. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.